I was really surprised to see last May appear in one of the many left-wing listservs that my name is on, an article posted there from Business Week called Socialism, Hardly Say Socialist. And partly my attention perked up because the woman who wrote this article, Moira Herbst, was a graduate from this university. I don't know, I'll leave it to you to conclude whether her being a graduate of Brown University has something to do with this excellent article or not. Excellent, certainly, in its quoting Sherry Wolf at length. Anyway, it's partly a piece in Business Week about the fact that suddenly the word socialism is everywhere you look, everywhere you turn, from these right-wing nuts who, get themselves on TV, and unfortunately not only Fox TV, to other places as well. And this is an article that, what a brilliant idea. If you want to know something about socialism, ask a socialist. It's a really good idea. And one of the socialists they asked was Sherry Wolf, who said, I'll just read a couple sentences from this interview. "We believe the class that produces the wealth should own and control the wealth." That's a far cry from what's happening now. This by way of responding to people who have been saying that President Obama is a socialist or a closet socialist or would like to be a socialist if he could only get the support. And then she ends this interview with Moira Herbst in Business Week by saying, "We haven't seen Comrade Obama at a meeting." Sherry Wolf is a really important leader in this particular movement and a great political speaker and writer. Anyway, please welcome her to Brown University, Sherry Wolf.
Actually, in answer to your question, I had no clue when I set out to write this book that a movement would erupt right around the time when it was released, although it was released just a few weeks ago in June, in time for the anniversary, the 40th anniversary of the Stonewall Rebellion that took place in New York City in 1969. And frankly, like most good things that have happened in my life, it was just pure dumb luck. I want to say something about what happened last night, because in some ways it punctuates why I wrote this book, and one of the things that I felt needed to be said in uncompromising, unabashed left-wing terms. And I was at a meeting in Portland, Maine, and where, of course, there is a struggle going on right now, which I'll talk about the movement stuff at the end of my comments. And I talked about intersexuality and the fluidity, not only of gender identity, but actually of sex itself. How many people here know what intersex is? It's fine if you don't, that's okay. It was not any fault of your own. Intersex, basically there are millions and millions of people in the world who have anatomical variations in which they have ambiguous genitalia, some of them internally, some externally. Some people have internal testes as well as ovaries, breasts, a penis, various combinations. It could also refer to a chromosomal variance, women being on average XX, men XY, some people have XXY. Actually, a professor at this university who I think probably wrote the most brilliant book to understand this, and so blessedly understandable, Anne Fausto Sterling, who wrote Sexing the Body as well as Myths of Gender, I think is absolute brilliance. If you haven't read those books, run out and get them. Or take her class. I've never been a student here. God knows they'd never take me. But she sounds wonderful. I've never met her. But I learned a great deal from her. And I write about it at length in the book when I spoke about it in the midst of my comments in the talk, because I've been writing quite a bit about it lately, because I've co-authored some pieces for The Nation with a friend of mine, Dave Zirin, who is a sports writer, a left-wing sports writer, the only left-wing sports writer perhaps in this country. We wrote about Caster Semenya, the scandal around the South African sprinter who should be celebrating by all rights the greatest victory of her life. That happened in Berlin a few weeks ago when she broke world records, this 18-year-old black South African woman, and instead she's on suicide watch because in the great, sort of the convergence of sexism, racism, and homophobia, the International Sports Federation tests for your gender. And because, of course, she ran too fast and she looked too good, and therefore she can't really be a woman. Because, she was chiseled muscles and a handsome face, and I don't see what's wrong with that, but somehow they had a problem with that. And of course, she's black and didn't conform to somebody's conception of beauty, and found that she has, in fact, or leaked to the media at least, that she has, in fact, internal testes, which she never knew about. And now she has pulled herself out of competitions and is, profoundly depressed and confused. Here is a woman who's lived her whole life as a woman. And I talked about this last night, and really, for me, something very powerful and important happened, and that was, a man raised his hand after I spoke, and an older man in the audience in his late 60s, and he said, my name is Richard, I grew up in rural Maine, and I am intersex. And described his life as a man who lived the first 57 years of his life in the closet with hiding his breasts. He's a construction worker, and had fathered 2 children, biologically fathered 2 children with a woman, and had served in the military. And at the age of 24, when he had already fathered 2 children and served in the military, he began to menstruate. Which utterly terrified him, and led to a whole life of a great deal of shame and internalized feelings of hatred. And he had never before heard anybody speak in a meeting or write about intersexuality, and was so thankful that he was given an opportunity to come out, if you will, in a public forum and say something about his life and be accepted and proud and embraced, as all people should be, for the diversity of humanity. And I feel, and I say something about Ricky, because I think that one of the I've been an activist my whole life. I've been an activist since I'm a teenager for the last 25 years, and I'd never written a book before, but I certainly read plenty of them. And I've always found books as weapons of sorts in struggle. And I don't see this book, Sexuality and Socialism, as being something that is to be sort of sitting on a shelf or just debated in the academy, although I hope it is, or in cafes. It was written in a style and in a language and with a thought and an eye to people actually taking action on the basis of its words, because I believe that books are weapons, but human masses are even, is what puts them into motion. And I really, I'm so proud that somebody like him and hopefully many other Rickies out there will feel the courage out of this LGBT movement, in the sense that in the late 60s and early 70s, when the gay and lesbian liberation movement led to the ability of transgender people to come out and fight for their rights and their personhood, for this LGBT struggle in our modern era, to create an opening for intersex people to finally come out of the closet, be embraced, and end the sort of barbaric treatment that goes on in this country once and for all. If you are a fan of long, plodding, impenetrable prose, I swear you will not like this book. I've read many of those books in preparation for this book. I feel like an explorer in another world when I read about sexual theory sometimes, because I feel, how is it that they managed to write books about sexuality and sex and make them so frigging dull? And so this book takes a different approach. I think that if you're going to talk about sexuality and politics and history and theory, you ought to be able to pepper it with some interesting, or hopefully useful, insights about things like clitoral orgasms, lesbian porn, and of course fist fucking, which I do. So if you're into that sort of a book, then you will like Sexuality and Socialism, and it's only $12, so Jesus, put a crowbar in your wallet and take a look. I want to say a little bit about what I do in the book, because I won't have time, obviously, in the course of these comments to go through everything, but I want to touch on a few things that I do explore in the book, and not the least of which is the roots of LGBT oppression. Because, of course, if you've grown up LGBT, or if you've just grown up in our society, regardless of your gender or sexual identity, it seems to be something that is super historical, and yet it has roots, it has a beginning. And so I talk about that in the book, and talk about whatever happened to gay liberation, how a movement that exploded onto the streets. Stonewall is when it's best known for, but of course there have been struggles prior to that. That was a turning point of sorts because it led to organizing efforts. But how it is that a movement that exploded onto the streets demanding liberation wound up becoming a market niche, with movements brought to you by Citibank and Miller Beer, as anybody who's been to a gay pride parade in the last decades can tell you. And I found it quite curious that an argument when I was coming up in the 1980s that would have only existed on the far reaches of the most conservative voices of our movement, or even outside of our movement, which is this argument about biological determinism having something to do with sexuality, has now found its way smack in the middle of many, many progressives' understandings about their own sexuality and their gender identity. And I really wanted to explore how this came about and to take on some of the myths of genes and gender, which I do in the book, as well as talk about the rise of the homocons, the sort of, you know them. They're the ones they always put on TV. The sort of gay, Andrew Sullivan's, although he writes some decent stuff lately, but sometimes he seems to think that marriage is the only issue facing people who are LGBT, which seems to be the only issue he's facing, because I guess when you have a few $1 million, life is pretty grand. But I also wanted to take on this relationship and many of the mythologies that dominate inside of the academy and inside of left circles, the mythologies about the history of the relationship between the left, including the far left, the Marxist left, not just in this country, but globally, and questions of sexual liberation and LGBT struggles to deal with and confront why have some of these movements been backward, and how it's very much in opposition to the liberatory core of Marxism and a rich other history that we're never told. And then I do talk a fair amount about how it is that we can begin to unite the oppressed and exploited to fight for a different world, because I think that beyond the sort of, moral suasion that, we should all unite and come together and sing Kumbaya, but that there are actually material reasons for us all to join together, and there are means through which we can find common identity in our struggles. One might not be able to identify as a transgender person, but certainly people, I believe, can identify with transgender people and fight in common cause. And finally, I deal with what is this question of sexual liberation anyway. Our horizons have been reduced, the bar has been lowered to thinking that all we can ever do in our lives is fight for tweaks, to sort of rearrange the chairs on the Titanic, so to speak. But some notion of genuine sexual liberation has disappeared from the discussion of the LGBT movement in some decades, and I wanted to return it, not only for the sake of LGBT people, but it strikes me looking around the world as I've passed through it these last 4 decades, that we don't appear to be, we may be more oppressed, but there seems to be a great deal of sexual repression that straight people experience as well. And so I talk about sexual liberation for all, what would that mean, how would that come about, and all the rest. Now, I'll start by giving some feel of the book itself and reading a couple of passages, if that's okay, and then sort of move on to talk about the political moment we are in right now. And the first thing I want to say is to talk about the construction of homosexuality, because not to say that somehow around the rise of the Industrial Revolution, people started fucking differently. I don't believe that's true. It is not my contention that suddenly sex got spicier long about 1860. Probably unlikely. I think so long as human beings have walked the planet, I'm sure they figured out all sorts of interesting and creative ways to diddle with each other. But what is new, and what was new, is that the late 19th century actually created the kind of conditions in which your sexual orientation was a salient feature of your being. And that was a new stage in human history. And I'll quote a bit from from the book here to give you a flavor of what it is I'm arguing. And obviously, for those who studied some of this, I draw heavily on John D'Amelio for this analysis. He does put forward a Marxist analysis in Capitalism and Gay Identity, an essay he wrote about 26 years ago that for some reason doesn't get around nearly enough. And I flow from his argument quite a bit. Modern capitalism created this social space for a gay identity to emerge. Industrial and financial centers concentrated people in huge numbers, thereby creating the potential for anonymity that had never existed before in human societies. Having created the possibility for individuals to live apart from their families and to experiment with alternative sexual practices away from the narrowness of rural life, capitalist society then sought to define and repress this new sexual deviance. Industrial capitalism's hostility to homosexuality is unique in comparison to previous societies' laws punishing alternative sex practices. Whereas old laws condemned homosexual acts that threatened procreation, new prescriptions were enacted against a small class of people whose behavior set them apart from the majority. As British socialist Noel Halifax puts it, under capitalism, sexuality was now not a private affair regulated by traditions and prejudices of the community, but became a public matter for the state. And that is simply a fact of history, that of course people in molly houses in the 1700s men would have had sex with each other, but they went home to their wives. Or in feudal societies, men, or for that matter, occasionally women, would have done whatever men and women can conceivably do with each other, but they would not have been able to live outside of the nuclear family. And for this, I think there is actually a good deal of importance that I place on this as a Marxist, as a materialist, because I think that when things like Prop 8 pass, it is often reducible in the public discussion that the reason why LGBT people are oppressed is because repugnant ideas dominate in our society and are put out there by bigots. Now, repugnant ideas do dominate in our society, and they are largely promoted by bigots. That's why we call them bigots. But that's a necessary but not sufficient explanation for why it is that these ideas dominate and not another set of ideas. And so I think for that we need to actually have a material explanation for who is benefiting from this state of affairs and how the society is organized, in particular the family. Because even though we've all grown up in a society that would like to have us believe, certainly if you're a politician or somebody who leads a church or synagogue or mosque, or if you watch a lot of laundry detergent commercials and you see the sort of Norman Rockwellian norm that is just sort of flashed across the screen endlessly, we've come to think of the family as this sort of, kind of cozy, warm, fuzzy place where we fight a lot. And depending on your family, structure, it's, either weight more on one end or the other. But I think that we have to have a material understanding about why the family dominates as it does, as and is so fiercely protected by the right wing. I mean, after all, what could be more tepid than the demand to get married? And the family values crowd, holds tenaciously to this, this notion of the family, the mama, papa, 2 kids, a dog, a white picket fence. And I think that we need to understand the family, the nuclear family in modern society, playing an entirely different function. Really, it is a means for the capitalist system, for the people who own and control what Marxists would refer to as the ruling class, to basically get away on the cheap and privatize things that ought to be social needs. Things like childcare, things like the feeding of what they would refer to as this generation of workers and the next generation of workers, what we call us. And I think that if you understand the family as being an ideal place for the people who run society and whose ideas naturally dominate in our society, then you begin to grasp how it is that the family plays such a central role as an incubator for gender norms. It really is where we are taught to be men, proper men and women, and as well as how to take orders and how to abide by certain rules. It also becomes a means through which the people at the top of society are able to justify continuing to pay women 73 cents on a man's dollar if their function is not primarily as workers, but actually as caretakers for the young and nurturers and all the rest of that. They are able to somehow cobble together a set of beliefs that the family is absolutely urgent and necessary. Now, I want to move on to talk a little bit about this other thing that I touched on before about the sort of biological argument that has become so dominant, because it really, there's, for people who are, under 30, I think it is so dominant that people are so used to thinking that way. Radicals put it out there, progressives put it out there, it seems normal, it has such a great social utility. And I can understand why, because if you are LGBT and you feel that you've always been this way and you can never remember a time that you felt any other way, it has a certain commonsensical reality to it. And for people who are civil rights activists, it has a certain utility as well, because you can argue, as many people do, that, well, if you can't really do anything about it, if you're just sort of naturally that way, then really you can't deny people rights on that basis of something that they simply can't alter, that they had no power over, and is not, as we used to refer to it in the 80s, a preference. People used to refer not to a sexual orientation, but to your sexual preference. And even for the right wing, it's got a great social utility as well, because if it's something that's diseased, like Tay-Sachs or sickle cell, well, then you can surely find a cure. Or at least you can treat people through psychotherapy and get rid of this, this disease of homosexuality. So I found not only people like Fausto Sterling quite useful in this regard, but anthropologists, people like Eleanor Burke Leacock, who writes The Myths of Male Gender, Myths of Male Dominance. There's probably another book somewhere out there about the myths of male gender, but I haven't read it. It should be written. Why do men have emotional range from A to B? This is what I write about, because I find the way Fausto Sterling puts it, I think is quite useful, because what we are often taught is the sort of counterbalance to biological determinism is, right, if it's not nature, then it's got to be nurture. It's got to be environment. And it seems very, well, binary. And I guess if this book is at war with many things, not the least of which is that we are switches that are either or. And the way she puts it is, if the first take-home lesson in thinking about complex human traits is that linear chain-like causal explanations are simply wrong, then the second is that the alternative idea of environmental determinism is also an oversimplification. In other words, there can be an interplay between the two of them. And you can, if you think about it makes perfect sense in many things that we are familiar with. I mean, you think about, I'm really into sports, and I like watching the Olympics, in particular swimming, and this last year's Olympics in Beijing, it was impossible not to notice Dara Torres. Dara Torres was a year ago, a 41-year-old mother of a small girl, I think she's 2 or 3, who swam faster than people half her age, including men half her age, and went on yet again to win silver medals in Beijing in 2008. Now, her physique, this chiseled, six-pack ab, sinewy muscled, uber athlete, is a social creation as well as a creation of her own biology and her own personal skill and talent and drive and what have you. That it would have been inconceivable even 20 years ago for someone to have, in her 40s, after having given birth, to have accomplished an extraordinary feat like that. And all of that would have been inconceivable, really, without the women's movement in this country, without the sort of social factor of civil rights to open up the doors for women our age, her and my age, to actually be able to compete on an international scale. Title IX that comes about in 1972. These are socially created realities. And then you think about the fact that here is this woman whose body would have been seen as utterly heretical even 25 years ago. I mean, I can remember when Martina Navratilova came on the scene with her big bulging muscles and her, just sort of unapologetic sort of glare, grunting, no less, she was dismissed and derided as too manly and disgusting. And of course, she also happened to be gay, so that sort of explained it all, didn't it? She was mannish. And today, Dara Torres is splashed on the front cover of the New York Times Magazine, not to deride her, but to say this is an icon of what women in the 21st century can actually look like. So we see the interplay already about biology and environment and how it plays such a central role in our lives. And I go on to argue something else in addition. Of the many scientific and political problems with the search for a gay gene, one seems primary. What does it even mean to say someone is gay? We cannot identify LGBT people across time and place, which would have to be the case if sexuality were biologically determined. It is neither historically nor culturally accurate to argue that sexual activity between older men, who also had sex with women, and younger boys in ancient Greece, same-sex activity inside prisons, where options are by definition limited, and consensual sex between two men in 21st century Brooklyn amount to behavior displayed by the same sexual human type. Even men in some Latin cultures today who are married to women but periodically have penetrative sex with other men would never consider themselves to be gay or even bisexual. To these men, machos or activos, only those in the receptive sexual role, hotos, are homosexual. Some Americans might insist that they are simply in denial and must own up to our society's definition of gay and straight. In fact, that's precisely how one scientist described his approach. There are societies in which people don't call themselves gay, but they certainly do stuff we would call gay. However, this approach amounts to viewing others through a biased cultural lens. And what about bisexuality, or how transsexuals did not emerge as a separate type of person until the 20th century? Viewed in this way, the search for a genetic origin of human sexual behavior is a quixotic endeavor at best. And it always strikes me, I have to say, the whole political project of finding a gay gene it pissed me off from the very get-go. I was like, why don't they try and find a gene for like warmongering assholes? Seems there are a lot more of them, actually. Certainly heading up government, I don't know. I want to end some stuff about the book and move on to talking a little bit about the movement today and struggles by talking about sexual liberation, because it never gets talked about and it doesn't get theorized about enough. And it strikes me that whenever people have gone into struggle against the dominant economic and social order, questions about the way the sexual order is arranged have come into play as well. And so it's hardly surprising that the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution led to an efflorescence of debate about sexuality, free love. One of the first things they did was eliminate all laws against sodomy, against homosexuality. There were same-sex marriages. There were actually the earliest recorded sex change operations, although God knows I shudder to think what the 1920s sex change operations were like. But, and of course, in the 1960s, when people went into all-out rebellion against the status quo, fighting against the war, fighting for black power, fighting for a different kind of system, people began to approach questions about the way the family was organized, women's roles, obviously, and certainly the confining and even what I would call asphyxiating sexual norms of our society. What would sexual liberation mean? We can perhaps agree on what must disappear: institutional and legal discrimination against LGBT people, fixed gender roles and sexual identities, legal constraints on consensual sex, and social repression of sexual experimentation, etc. While many of us dream of a world in which we are free to do as we choose with our bodies and sex lives, living under capitalism where sex is bought and sold, bodies objectified, and relationships constrained by material forces out of our control, it seems that even our fantasies must be limited somewhat by the world in which we live. The ubiquitous use of sexual images to sell everything from beer to toothpaste, and shifts in popular culture that have normalized skimpy clothing and near nudity, exist alongside a culture of sexual repression and a formal educational policy of denying crucial sexual knowledge to youth. Sex education in the United States in the early 21st century has been reduced to puritanical abstinence-only lectures, denying young people knowledge about the most intimate functions of their bodies, including how to use a condom in the age of AIDS. According to the latest Centers for Disease Control and Prevention survey taken in 2007, nearly 2/3 of high school seniors said that they have had sexual intercourse, and 22% said that they have been with at least 4 partners. Yet they are provided little to no information about birth control or sexually transmitted diseases. And I go on in that vein, and then go on to say, LGBT people can rarely glimpse images of people like themselves on the screen. Even lesbian porn is largely the domain of some straight men's fantasies, complete with spiked heels, cosmetically enlarged breasts, and women touching each other with long, sharp nails in ways very few women would ever find physically gratifying. If you need to ask about that, we'll talk about it later. Perhaps the virtual media blackout on LGBT sex has its upside, since the images of straight sex on the screen are overwhelmingly dominated by conventionally good-looking and unimaginably toned young people who always appear to know exactly how to touch each other from the first moments, and who invariably climax simultaneously, beating the statistical odds on such events. This constant bombardment of unreal sexual images and cosmetically altered or chiseled gym bodies not only promotes phony models of sex, but stokes feelings of sexual inadequacy and contributes to negative body images. From the Kinsey reports of the late 1940s and early 1950s on men's and women's sexual behavior, to the Haidt Report studies on men's and women's sexuality in the 1970s, medical and social scientists have researched sexual practices and pleasures. The conclusion drawn by Sherry Haidt, who studies psychosexual behavior and has done extensive research on sex practices and attitudes, is, we haven't had a sexual revolution yet, but we need one. And I think what becomes primary, because when I read in certain corners of queer theory, ideas about what we need to do is just kind of, well, essentially fuck our way to freedom, which I'm all for trying. But I think it's not simply a matter of variety and frequency that is the problem, but that we actually lead lives that materially constrain us. When you get up in the morning, and maybe you have children, I thankfully do not, but if you have children, then you have to get them ready for school or whatever it is you get them ready for, and then you have to get yourself ready to work, and then you have to sit in a lengthy commute, and then you go to a place you don't want to be that you get to play too little for, if you're lucky, and then you spend 8 or 10 or 12 hours there, and then you go back and you do another commute, and then you come home and you cook and you clean and you take care of kids, or you do whatever it is that you do. This is not the environment. This is not a recipe for sexual experimentation and excitement. And so, as a result, many of our sex lives suck, or aren't as good as we'd like them to be. And even though we all know that people who talk openly about what they prefer to have or what excites them and turns them on, according to statistics, very few people actually do. And very few women actually ordinarily, on a regular basis, have orgasms and are either too unaware or too terrified to tell their partner that it's up there, not in there. So I talk about this because I think it's important to combine not just a sort of ideological change and sea change that must take place in our society, but how there is an interplay, and there has to be a dynamic with real material struggle and change in our society. That it's not enough to simply, try your best to live differently. There's a reason why people want to have a soulmate, a sort of emotional life raft out there in a world in which there's nothing but anxiety and, and feelings of inadequacy, because our society makes us feel anxiety-ridden and inadequate. And so you try and find some sort of pleasure and some sort of security out there, and so we try to own each other as we try to own other things in a society surrounded by commodities. And so you have to combine the struggle for better sex, if you will, and better sex lives with a struggle for a better world, because the two are inextricably interwoven, in my opinion. And that takes me to where we're at today. If you had told me 10 months ago that over something as seemingly innocent as equal marriage rights, and of all places the state of California, that a reversal on a ballot measure would have led to an explosion straight across this country of tens of thousands of people taking to the streets to fight for equal rights, that was going to happen, I would have said, I fucking hope so. But I certainly could never have predicted that something like that would have been the catalyst for the current movement, which I was a participant 20 years ago, participant in ACT UP in Manhattan, and Queer Nation, and Lesbian Avengers, and all of these various groups. I was a participant as a socialist. That's a long story. Buy me a beer and I'll tell you. That was the most hostile environment I've ever organized in my life. So much for my community. But somehow if you actually advocated for universal health care and gay rights simultaneously, you were the enemy. But times have changed, and the movement today is no longer simply middle class, all white, male dominated. And what you see straight across this country is a much more multiracial, multi-generational, a movement that embraces straight people, in which straight people are actively a part of, that sort of separatism, or if you will, queer nationalism that dominated an earlier period, has really gone largely by the wayside in evidence in this movement. Much more anti-corporate, which is hardly surprising. States like Rhode Island don't need to be told what it is that is driving absolute hostility and hatred to the banks and the rich. And then, of course, there's a healthy skepticism that I think is quite useful and quite good and quite important of the Democratic Party and its ability or its desire to deliver the goods. Obama, you know, as we all know, is sort of a curious and contradictory figure. You know, at the same time, the first president to utter the word transgender and to actually issue this sort of extraordinary statement on the anniversary of the Stonewall Rebellion, celebrating a riot, just days later then issues this utterly draconian piece of horseshit defending, in a friend of the court brief, a defense of the Defense of Marriage Act, which basically equates equal marriage rights with you know, incest and other things. And I think the posture of this movement is so important and such a departure from previous years. And I really think in some ways it's a reflection both of a younger generation that was not told that, you know, that a disease that was ravaging an enormous portion of the community, as it did when I was in my 20s, most of the young men I knew either were very ill or died. ACT UP meetings used to begin actually with the reading of the names of the people who had died that previous week. And so I think that is one feature of a new sort of sentiment of rebellion. But I also think when you grow up in a society in which you see, you know, Will and Grace and the L Word and Ellen DeGeneres and, you know, True Blood, you know, and all of these things in which gay characters are everywhere, and gender bending, you know, Lady Gaga stuff is, you know, top of the charts. I think it became quite a shocker when people discovered one day, on the same night, of course, that an African American is voted to become president, that our rights were easily dispensable. And I think that's what actually drove tens of thousands of largely younger people into the streets to fight for equality, to fight for civil rights. This was not, you know, we want monogamy, the church, and the state. Those were not the demands I heard on these protests. They said, we want equality. We want to be treated like everybody else. We get your boot off my neck, is what people were saying. And I think this posture is incredibly healthy. And, you know, when I go around, I was in DC recently, you know, met these two young black lesbians who, you know, were thrown out of a diner in Silver Springs, Maryland one night, out of the Tasty Diner. And we know this isn't the first time that such a thing has happened when two gay people have embraced, two lesbians have embraced, but they didn't take it. They said, you've got to be kidding. And they showed up a week later with 50 other people. They had a sit-in and they had a protest, and now they're organizing for the March on Washington on October 11th. That's the new posture. That's the new kind of chutzpah that is driving this modern movement. I mean, the raids that have been going on in bars of all nights on the 40th anniversary of the Stonewall Rebellion in Fort Worth, Texas. The police chose that night to go raid the Rainbow Lounge, and they actually put somebody into critical care in the hospital. People held a protest the next week and within days of that, and they are also organizing for the National Equality March on Washington in October. And then just 2 weeks ago, at the Eagle Bar in Atlanta, a leather bar. It actually was underwear night at the Eagle Bar when the police went in to raid it. I'm living in Chicago these days, and there's a small town south of Chicago that when I worked in advertising for many years in Manhattan, the most useless profession in the history of the world. I was a proofreader. Nobody knew what the proofreader did, so I had lots of free time on my hands. I inserted commas, is what I did. They got $250,000 to write, do it, and I got $25,000 a year to put a comma in. there was an expression in advertising that said, you know, will it play in Peoria? And Peoria, Illinois, is sort of the so not San Francisco. It's the absolutely not Greenwich Village. It was supposed to be like Middletown, Anytown, boring USA. Well, when in Peoria a few months ago, a bar owner discovered that two gay people were touching themselves, touching each other. That might be against the law. Can't speak to that. He put out a sign in the front window of the bar that said, "This is not a gay bar." And people were like, well, fuck that, now it is. And they went in there the next night and they made it a gay bar. Made him take the sign down too. And I just think that that is the new posture, because frankly, the strategy over the last 35 years or so, 30 years certainly, of the movement of, you know, what I like to, and lots of other people call gay Inc., the establishment groups that have tens of millions of dollars, although I haven't a clue what the hell they do with it, you know, has been, we are going to tweak this, we're going to go state by state and issue by issue, and we're going to have little referendums. I mean, if you actually talk to the Equality Federation, they will tell you, we have a 20-year plan to win marriage in the US. And you thought, a 20-year plan? You've got to be kidding. I'll be eligible for Social Security damn near. I just think that this is being rejected. This is a strategy that is utterly bankrupt. And frankly, it didn't work too well with the ERA. Women still aren't written into the Constitution, and that one first showed up in 1923. It was re-raised in 1972, and every year the Equal Rights Amendment gets raised by somebody. Just a few weeks ago, Carolyn Maloney in New York raised it again. But they still don't have 38 states on board. We cannot wait for bigots until we demand our civil rights, which is why I'm so proud to have gotten on board with Cleve Jones, who was Harvey Milk's collaborator, and many, many others who put out the call and said, screw this, enough of this, we want it all, no more crumbs, we're not gonna start, you know, asking for this little, you know, tweak. I mean, what's happening in Maine right now makes the case perfectly. You can actually win your rights and then weeks later have them either taken away or threatened to be taken away, and you've got to fight the whole battle all over again. Enough of this, enough. 35 years ago, it was proposed that gays and lesbians be added to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That's what we want. We want full equality, we want it now, we want it in all 50 states and all matters covered by civil law. Be done with it once and for all. It's the 21st century. And I think that people here who feel that way, who believe in equality, you've got to act like equal human beings. You've got to act in solidarity with other people who don't have their equality. This is our Rosa Parks moment, and we are insisting on sitting in the front of the bus. Go to the march.